Professor Carrington, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're so happy to have you with us here today, and we're going to turn it over to you for some opening comments on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution's checks and balances, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, wonderful. It is so good to be back with you all. I've been such a fan of what Constituting America is doing and the needed civic education that we're a part of as well at the Ashbrook Center. So glad to be having this conversation and hope we can all learn together from it. Looking at the Declaration first, I wanted to mention two important Americans and what they've said about the Declaration. Both of these probably will not be too much of a surprise to people, but it might be a good way to set the table. And that's first Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration, who nearly 50 years after it was written in 1825, so actually just over 200 years ago, declared that it was, quote, an expression of the American mind. So the Declaration expresses how Americans think, what they think, the basic principles to which we're connected. The other is Abraham Lincoln and his little written piece. It was actually never published, where he compares the Declaration and the Constitution to an apple of gold and a frame of silver, with the idea that the apple is the main point, but that the silver, the Constitution, exists for the sake of the apple. And what does it do? Just like any frame to a picture, it displays it so one can see it, and it protects it so that it's not damaged. So this relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution, I think, helps us think about how the Declaration is a contributor and really the background to the idea of checks and balances in our Constitution. But to do so, we need to think about what the Declaration says that can then lead to the idea of checks and balances in the Constitution. And I think it begins with understanding that in the Declaration, there's a theory of justice that is put forward, that is used to defend the American Revolution, and that it's grounded in a certain anthropology, or maybe I'll just say a fancy word for what human beings are like. And what is that theory, or what is that understanding of justice and of human beings? Well, we know the famous phrases that it dedicates us to the proposition, or Lincoln said that, but the self-evident truth, as the Declaration says, that all men are created equal, that this equality includes the possession of certain rights, rights that are called natural rights or unalienable rights, because they're given to us at our creation. Thus, they're an intrinsic part of what it means to be human. To be human is to possess these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so justice involves respecting this equality of all human beings in protecting and observing their natural rights. Now, this then leads in the Declaration, as we all know, to a theory of government. If that's what human beings are like, if that's what justice is, then the purpose of government is to secure those rights, to take them from a state of not being protected or being not protected enough, and making it so people can enjoy them, so people can live according to them. And then you have the means of government, that the just powers the government uses to pursue these purposes come from the consent of the governed. And that really also comes out of human equality. Equal people need to consent to being ruled. So, how does the Constitution display and protect these principles? Well, they do so in a number of ways, but I want to focus on our topic and the topic I know you all have been digging into in this series, and that is the checks and balances that the Constitution has. Now, first, what are these checks and balances? Well, at least I would say they are means by which one part of government can limit the actions of another. And we think of, say, the president's veto power, the impeachment power that is in Congress, or judicial review as exercised by the courts. And I think checks and balances come out of an observation that the Declaration implies but that the Constitution picks up on. And that is that if you look at what human life is like, there's a gap between what human beings deserve, how we should treat each other, and that's what the Declaration was talking about, and how we actually treat each other. And I think this plays out in two ways. Federalist 51 says that men aren't angels. And because men aren't angels, there's a need for the government to protect people from those who would prey upon them. I think that's the natural working out of to secure these rights governments are instituted among men. But government is also run by people. So there's a need to limit the government from itself oppressing. And our constitutional system does this through separation of powers and federalism. And I would say those things are linked to checks and balances, but they're not 100% the same thing. And what I mean by that is, say, take separation of powers. It is saying that political power is not one big monolithic thing. Instead, there are distinguishable government functions. All political power is either lawmaking, law enforcement, or deciding the disputes about the law. And we organize our government by distributing those three powers among three branches that are each constructed to do their particular job. But I think in doing their particular job, they are meant to make a government that is strong and effective enough to protect rights that are discussed in the Declaration and limited enough to not be a threat to those rights. And I think what checks and balances does is it is an added protection that allows for this system to work out its best way. And one thing it recognizes is that these three powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, are not naturally equal. The founders, in fact, said that the legislative power tends to overwhelm the others if there aren't any other factors playing in. And we could talk about why later if you're interested. But what checks and balances does is it allows one branch to step in and keep other branches from overwhelming the others and therefore being left unchecked to violate individual rights. So think of judicial review, the ability of the courts to limit the other branches to within the Constitution in particular actions. Or think of the veto power, as I mentioned before, the power where we give a little bit of the legislative power to the executive to allow him to check Congress. Or even Congress's ability in the Senate to approve or disapprove of executive officers before they take office. That's a limit on executive power. And I think this all allows, again, the back to the idea of the Declaration as the apple of gold. It helps to fulfill the content of justice, the purpose of justice as found in the Declaration, and that the Constitution really is a brilliant working out of those beliefs. And so that I think as we talk about them, we can talk about how the Constitution really needs the Declaration, but the Declaration really needs the Constitution. And that therefore, along with Jefferson, if we understand the checks and balances, we will better understand our own mind and therefore the American mind. So I look forward to talking a little bit more about this relationship with you all, and thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you so much. What a great overview of the importance of checks and balances in our Constitution and protecting our freedom. And I love that you started and ended with the apple of gold and the frame of silver. And that is how Janine, when she's designing our school speeches, has all of our speaking teams start with that exact example. And it's just so important to understand the relationship between the two documents. So, Janine, I know you've got a lot of questions. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. And am I on? Yeah. So Professor Carrington, I believe that the apple of gold's silver, silver frame, the Constitution is a silver frame. I learned that from your essay because you wrote an essay for Constituting America. And I read, and that's where I first learned about it. So thank you, because we really do incorporate that with our speaking, because it's a wonderful analogy, and it's also something that people can visualize, and they have experiences with that. We'll say, do you have a trophy case in your school do you walk by a trophy case and there's that trophy? Well, the trophy is the Declaration of Independence, and the case is the Constitution. So thank you. We got that from you.
Oh, well, glad to. And it's actually a biblical allusion. It's out of the book of
Yes.
Proverbs, which is
Uh-huh.
kind of fun too. So, I love the pictures that we have in American history that really help to teach us. And I'm so glad to hear that you're using that because I think it is such a powerful analogy.
I knew it was in the Bible, but I didn't know where. I thought it's Proverbs though. So I'll look that up. But anyway, thank you again so much. And the checks and balances, well, I talk about life, liberty, pursuit of happiness when I work with the students, but I also then say really what's equally as important, if not more, is this line that to secure these rights, our rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, governments are instituted among men, so we create a government deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And the consent of the governed then takes place, as you were talking about, in the in the United States Constitution, because it lays out all these checks to prevent tyranny. That's what I think these are. It's like, because anarchy, tyranny, things of that nature will then suffocate the rights, and then the consent of the governed can no longer speak or petition or assemble, things of that nature. I think, Professor Carrington, we're really seeing this right now, a wonderful check and balance displayed with the big, beautiful bill. And I don't know how many 15-year-olds or 21-year-olds or 32-year-olds are watching this right now. I think they're swimming in a pool or playing soccer, or not soccer, baseball, on vacation, or in 20s and 30s, you're figuring out who you are with marriage and career. You're not paying that much attention, but I believe that it's fascinating to watch how the House has their bill. They sent it to and it had to be passed. They sent it to the Senate, and the Senate then kind of creates their own bill, and it passed. That's a check. And now it's going back to the House, who may check it again and say, well, we don't really agree with everything the Senate said. And they have to kind of find a consensus. That's a check, because the consent of the people, we're all being represented by the senator, we're being represented and they're carrying our consent or not through the senators and the House of Representatives. And so then the bill, where we are right now, I think the House passed it. The Senate passed a different form. Now it's going to go back to the House, and they're going to have to find yet another bill. And then it can go to the president, who can veto it, send it back. These are elementary things students usually learn in school, but the consent all starts with us and our voices and our phone calls and our petitions and what we want, and calling a representative and say, we want this, we don't want this. So the voice of the people should never stop, even when the baton has been passed to the representative. But you want to talk about that check and balance that's happening right now. And I think people get irritated when representatives take their time or maybe balk or fight for something. Now in this day and age, it's like, oh, look how they're obscuring process. Well, but that's part of the process, is to be able to say, my constituents, the consent of my people in my state, don't want this. And so all those are great checks, don't you think?
Absolutely. And I think sometimes with our age of fast food, minute rice, of instant gratification with, say, media and YouTube and other things, where we privilege action a lot. And action's not a bad thing, but thought and discernment should precede action. And the founders were really wanting to set up the different avenues for making these kind of determinations that you were saying, for amending bills and having different chambers agree and making changes. They really wanted to construct the legislative branch around the concept of deliberation, because the idea of, if you're trying to create a good law and you're in a rush, or you're not getting enough perspectives, you're going to make mistakes. And those mistakes are going to end up hurting real people, failing to protect them, doing too much and oppressing them. And so, this conversation that the Constitution forces the House and the Senate to have, and forces the president to be a part of, gives these different perspectives, gives the ability to refine, to edit, and I think therefore may seem maddening to people who, like us, who really like decisive action. But I think it forces us to slow down and build better, write clearer, and therefore I think is a protection of our liberty.
And it's also what's happening. It's interesting because the legislative branch is checking itself because we're bicameral. We have the Senate and the House, so they check each other, and then they're checking the president, who wants he would have just passed this bill and done whatever he wanted, but that's a great check on the president, and then the president can then check them later if he wants to veto it, and then the House and the Senate can then check the president again if they override his veto. So it's really brilliant. And I think that we lose track of that. And I have to say, and I wrote a petition. Kathy and I walked it through the halls. She taught me how to do that since she was a chief of staff. But called the Truth Act, and it was about limiting the page numbers of the bills. And it was like, we need to limit the bills. The bills need to be read. They need to be understood. They need to be heard. And then when they need to testify under oath and things of that nature. It's testify and then heard. But one of the House of Representatives says, why don't you do some research and see how many pages the bills have been throughout the centuries? And when we did a white paper, we found out that most of the bills were about under 30 pages. And my Truth Act, the first T was limit the bills to 30 pages, so that everybody understands what's going on. And they really started to rise the page numbers in the 1980s. So it was a fascinating study. But my point is, my last H for truth was that the people have to hear the bill. And I proposed that the bill would be read aloud on the House floor or the Senate floor, because when it's read aloud, the people can actually hear it. And then it would then force them to realize how many pages their bills were and how voluminous, which talk about the Federalist Papers, James Madison said if the laws are so voluminous, incoherent that they can't be understood, or so voluminous that then what's the point of having your own government if we don't understand what's going on? So I'm not making any kind of party affiliation here or anything, but they did it. They actually read the entire bill on the House floor, 900 pages, and it took, I don't know, 48 hours or something of different people reading it. But I thought, yes, and a lot of people might have thought that was, blocking the big, beautiful bill, or, taking up too much time, too much deliberation. But I think it's beautiful, actually, that the people get to hear what's in it. Now they can go read it, but it's like, what website do you go to? It's a lot easier to hear it on C-SPAN. And they used to read the Declaration of Independence over the balconies. They would read them to the people. So I thought that was a lot of fun, and that is a sort of check. Is keep the people keep the bill so we can understand them. A lot of times the amendments are made and then no one knows where the amendments are or how to check the amendments, and to actually have it read out loud, I thought was a lot of fun. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, if you go even back to pre-American times, back to medieval and ancient times, a fundamental concept was that laws have to be what's called promulgated, meaning they actually have to be communicated to the people. And I think it goes both ways. If you go back to the Declaration, you need to be able to communicate the law so that people know how their rights are protected and can even protest if their rights aren't being protected. The other is, though, that we are dedicated to the consent of the governed, that Congress is not the ultimate legislative power in the United States. It is we, the people, by the Constitution's own declaration, and that is in conformity with the Declaration of Independence's own statement that their just powers of the government come from consent. So I think the idea that we make sure that people can understand. Otherwise, if government gets beyond the comprehension of the governed, then we no longer have self-government. I think it's that important. And in some ways, that is a kind of check on the legislative branch that leads to the ultimate check, which is the ballot box and whether the people assess these laws to be good or bad.
Or the telephone. I sometimes think as I said earlier, once the baton is passed and the representative takes it to DC, people think, oh, well, what can I do now? Or they're why not? Oh, I'm so afraid. Well, you can pick up the phone. You can call your representative. You can go see your representative in your neighborhood. You can email them. You can just go to a town hall. You can, if they're reading the bill and go, wait, I don't like that. We still have a voice, and the more people that call, the better. I think that's the key there. Well, okay, looky. It's like 7 seconds, 6 seconds. I did it on time today. I didn't overextend, Jewel. Look at that.
It's
all
always fun if you
yours.
go longer, Janine.
Thank you, Professor Carrington.
Yeah, yes, of course.
Hi, Professor Carrington. It's Joel Gilbert with Constituting America. I was enjoying listening to yours and Janine's discussion so far. I've learned a lot. Kind of have a bigger picture question to start off with, which is the Declaration of Independence, as we've talked about before on this podcast, is not necessarily the same type of legal document as the Constitution. But when you described Abraham Lincoln's way of framing what it is, which is what we use in our speeches as the golden apple that the Constitution upholds, it gives such a clear picture of what our government is attempting to do, trying to do, and the fundamental beliefs that underscore it all the way through. And I also believe that we see that all through the founding documents as well. So I guess my first question is that I know that the Declaration is not necessarily a law, but it seems kind of strange to me that we interpret law and don't refer to the Declaration at all, when we know that if we're looking at what the founders would have meant by things, that in general, it would have been able to be understood through the Declaration.
Yes, and you're right. It is a what its title says. You don't need to necessarily overthink it. It is a declaration of the colonies saying that they're going to be independent, whereas the Constitution is an actual framing of government. Um, but I think that's where, even with legal documents, I think what you're pointing toward is legal documents never come out of thin air. They don't drop from the sky. They have a context. And there is no more important context to the Constitution. I mean, yes, you can look at the Northwest Ordinance, you can look at speeches made by in the Constitutional Convention, you can read the Federalist Papers, but there really is no more important context for for the Constitution than another document, and that is the Declaration of Independence. And that's where I think we have to understand that structures like Congress and the presidency and the judiciary, bills of rights like what we have attached to the original Constitution, these all are downstream from prior commitments, from prior declarations. And so seeing that relationship, do I think do I think like a judge should merely enforce the Declaration of Independence directly? No, because that's not its role. But I think it would be missing the point to not refer to the Declaration of Independence to better understand the Constitution, and to say, if I think there is a misunderstanding or a dispute about what, say, the First Amendment means, or what separation of powers in the Constitution means, that the Declaration often has, if not the answer, at least an important contribution to understanding it.
Yeah, thank you. And it seems like we've learned so much on the shows. We talk to scholars like yourself, and we understand the founding documents more and more each podcast. And in modern education, in the classes I took, there's oftentimes it's just a fracturing of the spirit of the law and the letter of the law to quite a big degree. And if I think of something particular, I could think of that. If you look at the beginning of the Declaration, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That alone, you could make a case based on some court cases, even that a school wouldn't necessarily even be allowed to teach that if it wasn't necessarily the Declaration, because of an infringement on, let's say, religious liberty of non-believing students or something like that. But when we break ourselves down to such a granule degree, and we kind of really separate the spirit of the law from the letter of the law, it really becomes kind of incoherent in America's founding for what the founders were trying to create. And I guess that's kind of what I was pointing to in what you answered, which is that, no, should judges probably, invoke the words of the Declaration? I guess not. But at the same time, it does seem important in education and in when we're seeing what do we think is constitutional or not to think about those words and think about that there's literally stuff in there that I don't know if we'd always be even comfortable saying if it wasn't just that everybody knew, oh, it's the Declaration of Independence.
Sure, and I would say I think it's fine for judges to maybe invoke the Declaration just as a way of understanding and applying the Constitution itself. But but yes, I think again the and I think e- a good classroom and I think a good teacher is not going to make students agree with everything the teacher believes or even everything that they're reading in a document, even if it's a document that we as Americans hold in very high esteem, like the Declaration. I think the Declaration is um, deep enough, thoughtful enough. The Constitution is brilliant enough that it can stand up to students poking at it, criticizing it, pushing against it. Not because necessarily every criticism is necessarily valid, but I think the learning process involves being able to take and face those documents seriously. So yes, and I think the idea of the letter and the spirit of the law is a part of that conversation. That um, you can't divorce the words from what they're trying to accomplish, and you can't twist the words from something other than what they're trying to accomplish. And that's why, in some ways, the art of self-government in a regime like ours that is based on the rule of law is fundamentally teaching people how to read. And I don't mean that in some condescending way, but to read beyond the surface words, to really dig in and be taught by and then learn to live according to um, principles that we see in these kind of documents. So yeah, I think those are important points.
Awesome. Thank you for a great answer. Now the answer to this could be no. I can ask a different question. The Declaration, incredible. These 13 colonies break away from an empire. Is there anything within the Declaration that you think like directly leads to some of the structures in our Constitution?
Yeah, and I had kept my opening remarks pretty theoretical, but where you really see that theory touching separation of powers in a very concrete way is the part that no one reads, but people should, which is the list of grievances, where the theory of the Declaration that I laid out is applied. There isn't a fully formed idea of checks and balances, but you can pull it from those. So it says that what the king has done is basically failed to follow the executive power. He has failed to protect the people of the colonies through enforcing the laws. It says that he has attempted to annihilate legislative power in the colonies, therefore denying consent to the governed and taking to himself a power that should ultimately be with the people of making their own laws, and that he has denied the trial by jury. He's denied impartial courts. He's tried to destroy the independence of judges in the United States, well, in the colonies at that point, soon to be the United States. And that you see in these grievances that certain assumptions about how the purposes of the Declaration are to be carried out are being thought of and implemented through these structures and these attempts to have these institutions be citadels of rights, not means for violating those individual rights.
Wow, excellent. And you're right about the grievances. I think it's just when we do these shows and anytime the Declaration comes up, I find it remarkable that our founders went to such great lengths to morally and rationally defend the right of the revolution to an extent and the right of the independence. And seeing the structure of government as explained through the grievances is a wonderful way to teach us to read them. Thanks so much. And I'll pass on to Wyatt. But if Wyatt wants me to use up my other minute later, I definitely can. So let me know. But thank you very much, Professor.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jewel, and thank you, Professor Carrington. What a great discussion and very appropriate discussion, considering that we're going to be celebrating the 249th anniversary of the Declaration, which is just hard to believe it's already the 4th of July. This year's just gone by very quickly. So I first wanted to ask about, you were talking about the list of grievances, and why were they all listed about the king rather than Parliament? Because especially like remember when there was many protests about no taxation without representation that had to do more with Parliament. So I was just kind of curious why they would pit it more against the king. Did that have to do with their arguments about having too strong an executive? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was the idea that the king sort of represented to some degree the sovereignty of the nation. Um, and I think that the other point is, if you know the backstory, um, for a while there was an attempt to say that Parliament was the bad guy, but appealing to the king as the one that would save the colonies from this legislative tyranny that was being handed down by the taxation without representation and the other sort of markers that were coming from Parliament. And I think uh, making the case against the king really completes the circle that there needs to be a break, that there is no entity, Parliament or the king, within the British government that really is recognizing and protecting the rights of the individuals. Because really, England was supposed to be based on a kind of separation of powers and checks and balances between the king and Parliament. Yet the idea was this is broken down and is no longer a dependable system for us to vindicate the purposes that we laid out in the earlier part of the Declaration. So I think those are at least some of the factors that are going on in the focus, and some of it relates to the history that had led up to that point and the battles with Parliament versus with the king.
Fascinating. And you kind of touched on my next question too. You were saying that England was built on a system of checks and balances. What were some of those specific examples that, that they set out to do, but in the end we found them not to be fulfilling them?
Yes, and it's interesting. Great Britain, their checks and balances grow up sort of organically, historically. They develop because England doesn't have a officially written constitution. We, as Federalist One says, were one of the we're a country that was based on deliberation and choice. We chose our founding, we chose our principles. But over time in England, you had the development of Parliament as the legislative branch, and the king, even though he had a participation in legislation, being primarily the executive power and the executive officer. That's why there was accusations that, oh, the president in under the new constitution is going to be a king. He's going to be a monarch. But the reason I think those broke down had less to do with separation of powers itself, as more the concept of consent and the ability to express consent. So, what interest did the king and parliament have in paying attention to and helping the complaints and needs of the colonists versus those subjects that were living in England? And the answer was not a whole lot. The system was really set up to privilege the consent given by those in England itself. And I think it's that breakdown of the connection between the colonists being able to hold Parliament or the king accountable and being able to get their attention that was the real breakdown. And so I think it's more that connection between the idea that government is supposed to represent the will and desires, the just will and desires of the governed. If you don't have an effective way of letting the people express their consent, then you're not going to have lawmakers and law enforcers who respect that consent. So I think that was the bigger problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just really love the point that you were saying, their checks and balances kind of come with time and with longer history. With ours, we started right off the gate with ensuring or enshrining these checks and balances in our system. Just a really neat point that you made to differentiate the American and British government. You were also talking about how some people were afraid that this new president was going to be sort of like a king figure. I mean, there were, if I'm not mistaken, some founders that were wanting to kind of make a king figure. Now, obviously, fortunately, that didn't happen, but I was just kind of curious if you could explain some of those checks that are found in the Constitution to make sure that the president was not a king.
Sure, sure. And in fact, Federalist, I believe it's 69. Yeah, I believe it's 69. Lays out sort of comparing the new presidency to the governor of New York and to the King of England,
Hmm.
and sort of says which is this office more like? Is it more like the governor of New York or the King of England? With the idea being it's much more like the governor of New York. So some of the differences. I think that the founders and some of the wisest of them understood that every form of government has inherent weaknesses. And that's just because human beings have inherent weaknesses, but different forms of government bring out different kinds of weaknesses. And so that a good republic, a good popular government needs to be aware of its own weaknesses and try to be true to itself, but also limit those sort of vices. And so I think the executive that they constructed, the president they constructed, recognized that what's good about a monarchy? It is decisive, it is active, it is powerful, and that's all really good for enforcing the law. So, can we have a solitary president that sort of takes those advantages of monarchy and uses them? But here's the problem: we don't want an actual monarch. So, what do? We ground the president in the consent of the governed. He's not born king, he is voted king. And moreover, we limit his power, maybe even more than kings, through having the impeachment process, which impeachment could never reach the king in the English system, just his counselors. Um, and so by making him popular, and making him impeachable, among other things, we subject him to the rule of law while still trying to get the advantages of monarchy itself, and therefore being a better version of a republic than maybe in republics past. So that's kind of the thread they were trying to needle. How can we find what's good about monarchy, but make it republican, make it popular? In a way that really I don't think had really ever effectively been done before in the way that they did it.
Absolutely. And I just really find that so fascinating. I mean, we owe so much to the founders because they were able to look at all forms of government, not only look at what's good about them, but looking at the bad things about them and the cons, and trying to figure out how we can mitigate that. How can we make sure that the weaknesses aren't actual weaknesses in effect? And that's just a really great point. You also talked about the legislative branch earlier, how the founders did not intend for them to all be equal, the branches, and you said the legislative. Why was that? Why did they feel like it was important to make the legislative branch the most powerful?
I'm glad you bring that up because I'd love to clarify maybe that a bit.
Hmm.
Now there's some debate on this. I don't know necessarily that they wanted the legislative branch to
Hmm.
be primary, although that's disputed. So I'll tell you, there's plenty of scholars that would disagree with me on that, but that it was naturally the dominant power. And why was it naturally the dominant power? Well, one was actually maybe not natural, but circumstantial. In the colonies, the legislatures were picked by the people, the governors were picked by the king. So there was already this predisposition of governors bad because they're doing what the king in England wants, legislatures good because they're doing what we want. But even beyond that, in Republican government, legislatures tended to dominate because they looked like the people. The people is a lot of us getting together and talking, Well, the legislature is a lot of people getting together and talking and making decisions, as opposed to a king or a president that looked like a king, or rogue judges that look like a kind of small elite. And then the third is, if you're in a regime that is based on the rule of law, the first and primary act on which all other acts depend is lawmaking. So the executive and judicial powers were dependent on what the legislative did, giving it preeminence and giving it an advantage. So the checks and balances were trying to limit to make sure the legislature didn't overwhelm and take over the other branches, given its natural advantages.
Yeah, very great point. Well, thank you. I'm out of time, so just thank you for answering all the questions, and what a great conversation. So thank you so much, Professor Carrington.
Sure. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Janine and Jewel and Wyatt and Professor Carrington. This has been a great discussion so far, and we're so appreciative of your time being on with us today. We want to take a minute and recognize one of the teachers who's in the audience today, Trent Toller, who's one of our We the Future contest winners. He and his brother Aaron won Best Constitution Lesson Plan. And so thank you, Trent, for tuning in and listening. If you are a teacher or a student listening and you'd like a shout out today, drop your name in the Q&A and we'll be sure and give you a shout out before the end of the program. We also want to thank our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats now on Thursdays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to everyone listening in Las Vegas. So, Professor Carrington, we've got some great audience questions and comments. First, I want to thank Robert Spiegler and Judith, who both have filled us in that it is Proverbs 25:11 that is the Bible verse that says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver." So, thank you, Robert and Judith, for looking that up. And then we'll go here to Julianne Smith, who says, I've heard it said that the Declaration is the why of government and the Constitution is the how of government. Would you say this is accurate? And if so, why or why not?
Why or how? Uh, yeah, I think that is a fine way to put it. That and I will say the Constitution has some hows, the preamble, and I think the Declaration has, or some whys, I should say. The Constitution has some whys in the preamble, and the Declaration has some hows, especially in the grievances. It's more by negation. So you look at what it says the king is not doing right. We'll do the opposite. But I think in general, the Declaration is setting out again a theory of government and justifying the revolution on the basis of how the king and England has fallen short of that. So the why is the focus. Whereas, yes, I think the Constitution comes out of a fairly broad agreement on these principles, and therefore concentrates more on how do we actually make this work? Because the wedge in between these two is the Articles of Confederation, and it really didn't work. It was the first frame to go around the apple, and the frame didn't adorn and it didn't protect. So I don't want to undermine the brilliance of the Constitution, because it's not easy to take the principles of the Declaration and make them work. Yet better than the Articles, and I think as well as any constitution we've seen in modern history, it's been able to accomplish what the Declaration set out, which is quite the accomplishment.
So true, and thank you. Nancy Copeland asks, is there a good article that lists where these grievances are put into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? And while you're thinking, I shared with Nancy, and I hope the audience can see it, one of our Constituting America's online studies from a few years ago was on the Declaration of Independence. And so we went through, in our online study, we went through each grievance and talked quite a bit about it. And I do believe we may have addressed, where in the Constitution some of these grievances ended up. And we also have an article on each one of the signers of the Declaration. So I put a link to that online study in the answer that I wrote back to Nancy. But do you have, off the top of your head, can you think of any book or essay
You,
that might address that?
you might want to check out, although this is more of a website, teachingamericanhistory.org, and it's got some, it's related to the Ashbrook Center, and it's got some subsites related to the Constitutional Convention and the Bill of Rights and some other things. And I think there would be some resources there, maybe not a one article fits all, but the ability to see those connections that I think would be, yeah, would could be helpful in addition to what you were pointing to, because yeah, it's very interesting, and they're fairly, once you know your Constitution, the grievances stand out. We protect the trial by jury, which was one grievance. We protect the existence of the legislature. We do a number of other things that when you read the grievances just stand out when you remember what the Constitution itself did. So I don't think they're that hidden or that opaque once you know both documents a decent bit. So by the way, when the fourth comes up, I'd suggest everybody read it on the 4th of July, including the grievances, and think about don't just eat hot dogs. Although eat hot dogs, those are great too. But yeah, I think uh, educate yourself in your own citizenship is always a good thing, and no better day than the 4th to do it.
Well, that's a great point. And we at Constitute America do social media on that each year and send out a newsletter and encourage everyone to read the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence on Independence Day. And we link also to a great recording of Janine reading the Declaration out loud. And she reads it very dramatically. And that's fun to listen to also. So that's a really good point. And I also want to remind everyone what Professor Carrington just said, that the Ashbrook Center does have really wonderful resources on the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. It's called, again, Professor, it's called teachingamericanhistory.org.
Yes, it is. Yep.
teachingamericanhistory.org. We encourage y'all to check that out. And I know our mutual friend, Professor Gordon Lloyd, did a lot of work on that website and with Ashbrook. And Professor Lloyd passed away a few years ago, and we were really sorry to lose him. But I know he worked so hard on that website. It really is an excellent resource. So thank you, Nancy, for that question. And going on here to, let's see, Jill Cullis, who is actually one of our Constituting America presenters, teachers. She's a retired social studies teacher, but she teaches the Constitution primarily for us in Colorado. Jill is asking if there's any examples of checks and balances of the Constitution that stand out to you in history, maybe where a check or balance was implemented that really made a huge difference in the way the country went, or the world historically.
Oh, that is a great question. I think I think the maybe the example of um, Marbury v. Madison, more for the precedent that it set
Mhm.
in establishing the capacity for the Supreme Court to exercise its judicial power in a way that therefore could try to keep the government as a whole within its constitutional bounds. Um, Also, I think, a really good moment comes in, say, the 20th century, where you have the example, certain examples from the civil rights movement, and that's more maybe a federalism provision, but you have, Brown v. Board of Education. You have the working together between the executive and judicial, or the executive and legislative branches to pass the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And I think the way that those legislative and executive processes worked out, in some ways it was a cooperation, but in some ways it also was a mutual checking that I think helped, move the country more toward its ideals of equal rights for all.
Well, thank you. And then Jill had a follow-up question asking about was changing the Constitution to have senators directly elected by the people, is that a better check than being elected by the state legislatures?
Uh, my opinion is no. Obviously, it's not the most popular opinion, and I'll say why. One of the ways that the Congress was meant to be a better deliberative body was, and the Federalist Papers say this, was to make the House and Senate as different from each other as possible while still making them both popular. And what I think you lose with direct election of senators is you lose the state centric focus that the Senate had. It is because voters in states will vote for all sorts of reasons. They'll vote for reasons about their own state, but they'll vote for reasons about party and nation. And I think that when state legislatures selected the senators, there was more of an accountability to say, hey, the Senate is meant to protect the interests of federalism, protect the interests of the states, and be a check on a sort of nationalization that I think would undermine the kind of delicate and precise give and take between not just the branches, but the state and national governments. I understand why they did it. There was some corruption and there was some smoke filled rooms with the state legislatures picking. But I think that um, the Senate and the House became more alike when you got direct election of senators. And I think that undermined a little bit, not completely, but a little bit, the ability for them to, by having different perspectives, refine, check, and make each other better in their deliberations.
Well, thank you for that. And finally, Tracy asks if the states, if the system of federalism, if the states are a check in any way on the federal government, how is the system of federalism, is that part of checks and balances?
Oh, absolutely. I focused on separation of powers, partly because there's more separation of powers than federalism in the Declaration. But absolutely, Publius in the Federalist Papers says it's a double security. One level of security is the separation of powers within a government. The other is federalism between the governments. And the ways this can be done, it can be done through the legislative branch, again, the Senate. The Senate is supposed to, with its equal representation and originally being selected by state legislatures, it's supposed to be a check on the national government. The Electoral College and its state centric way of electing the president was meant to be a federal system. Limitations on the government, on the federal government, like the Commerce Clause and other like provisions, were meant to preserve the powers of the states. And I think this is meant to go both ways. It's meant to limit both sides from overreaching, and it's also meant to say that, you know, some things are better handled nationally, like war and treaties and interstate relations. Other things are better handled locally. And that it not only is it meant to limit government, it's meant to make it most effective by putting the government that is best adept at doing a job in power and keeping the government that's not good at it out of power for that specific task.
Well, thank you. And that's a great way to actually end our podcast. We're right at the top of the hour. I do want to let you know of a few of our listeners who are teachers have chimed in on how great the website teachingamericanhistory.org is and how useful it is to them. Emily Bond says, I use that website for all my primary sources for my classes. And Judith says, great courses and webinars. I went there. So thank you for all you do at the Ashbrook Center. It's just a wonderful institution, and thank you so much for being with us today and being our guest. It's really so happy to have you, and we want to wish you and our audience a very happy Independence Day on July 4th as we celebrate, as I think Joel or Wyatt said, the 249th birthday of our Declaration of Independence.
Quite a pleasure to be with you all. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you, Professor Carrington. And everyone should also watch the movie, the musical 1776. It's so good, with parents' permission if you're under 18. But right, it's so amazing.
And we didn't even get to talk about that, about the fact that Professor Carrington was in 3 high school musicals, and
That's
you
right.
starred in 1776 in 5th grade. We got so busy we didn't get to go
Yeah.
into that.
But
I wish we'd done 1776. That would have been amazing. But yeah. Or I guess the kids are going to grow up doing Hamilton the musical too. Those would have been the
yeah,
two I would have told people to do. But
exactly.
yeah, I was in West Side Story, Grease, and Cinderella were the 3.
Wow, diverse,
Yeah.
diverse. That's
Yep.
great.
Yep. Those were a lot. Those were a lot of fun, and I love the intersection of the arts and teaching the
Mhm.
values of citizenship and humanity. And I just think it's a great way to have those stories inform us and help us to learn better how to be ourselves.
Well, and that's all Janine. That's her vision, and that's why she created Constituting America.
It's a great, we're a team. We're a team here. It's all a team. It's all teamwork. But anyway, happy 4th of July, everybody. Take
Happy
care. Thank you,
4th.
Professor Carrington. See you,
Thank
Jules.
you.
See you, Wyatt.
Thank
See you,
you.
Jorn. See you.